Well, welcome to HC Daily. Today is all about a bunch of yuck.
Yes, this is going to be a tough topic to deal with. It's one of the worst things that can happen in a family, and it winds up being results of some really bad decisions David had made earlier in his life, and now he's got to pay the piper.
He's got to pay for it.
That's what we're talking about today in HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So we've been utilizing our fire pit in the back of my house.
Yes.
And we sit around, and sometimes we just like to come up with discussion questions. So one question that we just did recently on Memorial Day weekend, they asked me, I'm going to ask you today.
Good.
They said, if you could step out of your vocation as a pastor and step into any other job for a few months just to experience it, and the key is, it's guaranteed to be a successful venture, right? So in other words, it's not just attempting a business, it is running a successful business, enjoying it at its fullest. Which vocation would you step into just to experience it?
Right off the top of my head, I want to be for like 3 months, 6 months, something like that. Yeah. An explorer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like discovering new things, like back in the 1800s?
Sure. So, like Dr.
adventurous?
Livingston trying to, figure out what's on the map. How do you put it on the map, whether it's in Africa or Asia. So today, they're exploring the ocean depths. They're trying to figure out the whole Antarctica thing. There's so many things. There's forests and mountain ranges that still haven't been explored, that kind of stuff. I think it'd be cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're sort of that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, you good with maps.
I think it'd be incredibly brutal, but it'd be really a fun one.
I told my family I'd like to be a talk show host.
Oh, that's not a surprise.
Think about it. It's fun the entire time. You play games with people. You meet celebrities.
Sure.
Which would be great.
So like, Chris Zarbaugh on The Tonight Show kind of a thing?
Yeah, for sure.
The Tonight Show with Chris Zarbaugh. Who'd be your first guest?
Oh, geez. I don't know. Don't say Zac Efron.
Efron.
Don't say it.
That's never going away.
Oh,
it's
geez.
never going. You open that can of worms.
You
it's
have
never
no
going
idea
away.
how many people came up to me and have said things, and I'm like, stop it.
Well, I've had a lot of people go, yeah, it doesn't surprise us. So either way.
No, they
Okay,
haven't.
2 Samuel 13. You don't know. 2 Samuel 13. We're reading one of the most difficult stories, I think, in David's life. This is the beginning of where things start to unravel as his sons become adults, right?
Yeah.
So he made a series of bad choices, and particularly we'll see over the next few days some really bad parenting choices and that kind of thing. But this one is one of the most devastating stories, I think, in David's life. So we're going to read a few verses. Then, rather than reading all the gory details, we'll kind of summarize a portion of the story. Then we'll finish up with the rest of the passage, okay? So in 2 Samuel chapter 13, it says in verse 1, Now David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and Amnon, her half-brother, fell desperately in love with her. Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. She was a virgin, and Amnon thought he could never have her. But Amnon had a very crafty friend, his cousin Jonadab. He was the son of David's brother Shimea. One day, Jonadab said to Amnon, What's the trouble? Why should the son of a king look so dejected morning after morning? So Amnon told him, I am in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. So Jonadab then goes on and says, well, you're the king's son. You can have whatever you want. So let's put together a plan and you'll just take Tamar. So he says, pretend like you're sick. Then ask your dad, Dad, I need some help. Would you send Tamar to take care of me? And then when she's fixing a meal, you just have your way. Send all the servants out, have your way. And that's what happens.
Yeah.
Is that Amnon then attacks Tamar. He rapes her. And then immediately, the Bible says he hated her. As much as he had loved her before, he hated her immediately afterwards.
Yeah, I remember that as a kid, hearing sermons about that, saying immediately afterward, he said he had just as much hate for her as before he had love for her, which means it really wasn't love.
Well, verse 15, it's not on the screen, but it says, Then suddenly Amnon's love turned to hate, and he hated her even more than he loved her. Get out of here, he snarled at her. And she begs him, no, now, and in that culture, now at this point, he needs to take care of her. or nobody else will ever take care of her. That's kind of how that culture would have worked. And so she begins to beg him, no, you've ruined my life. I can't leave. And he demands that the servants take her out. They slam the door. It's a really horrible circumstance. So she goes into mourning. She tears her robe. She puts ashes on her head. And she just is a broken woman because of this horrible attack from her stepbrother.
Yeah, and all of those strange things are outward symbols of the greatest kind of mourning that you can
this is how you
experience.
would demonstrate that
Your
you're
sorrow.
just devastated, you're broken.
Yeah, broken.
So then we'll pick up in verse 20. Let me see in verse 20. Her brother Absalom saw her and asked, is it true that Amnon has been with you? Well, my sister, keep quiet for now, since he's your brother. Do not worry about it. So Tamar lived as a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard what had happened, he was very angry. And though Absalom never spoke to Amnon about this, he hated Amnon deeply because of what he'd done to his sister. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Bel-Hazor near Ephraim, Absalom invited all the king's sons to come to a feast. He went to the king and said, my sheep shearers are now at work. Would the king and his servants please come to celebrate the occasion with me? The king replied, no, my son. If we all come, we'd be too much of a burden on you. And Absalom pressed him, but the king would not come, though he gave Absalom his blessing. Well, then Absalom said, if you can't come, how about sending my brother Amnon with us? Why Amnon? The king asked. But Absalom kept on pressing the king until he finally agreed to let all his sons attend, including Amnon. So Absalom prepared a feast fit for a king. Absalom told his men, wait until Amnon gets drunk. Then at my signal, kill him. Don't be afraid. I'm the one who's given the command. Take courage to do it. So at Absalom's signal, they murdered Amnon. Then the other sons of the king jumped on their mules and fled. So as they were on their way back to Jerusalem, this report reached David. Absalom has killed all the king's sons. No one is left alive. The king got up, tore his robe, and threw himself on the ground, and his advisors also tore their clothes in horror and sorrow. But just then, Jonadab, the son of David's brother Shimea, arrived and said, no, don't believe that all the king's sons have been killed. It was only Amnon. Absalom has been plotting this ever since Amnon raped his sister Tamar. No, my lord the king, your sons aren't all dead. It was only Amnon. I think we'll stop there.
Yeah.
So this is a pretty horrible story. Now, you got to remember, do you know how many wives David had?
8, I think.
He had 8 named wives. In 2 Samuel, I think it's chapter 5, it says he went back to Jerusalem and married a bunch more women. So we don't know exactly how many, but there's 8 named wives. And then he had
concubines on top of that.
Yeah, at least 2 different groups of 10 are mentioned in the Bible. So he had many, 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 many women. And this is one of David's issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's finally starting to catch up to him.
And let's remind our listeners that this was never okay with God.
No.
So this was done in culture, and David decided to treat himself like other kings.
Right.
And this is an issue in his life. And because he did that thing with Bathsheba, it was told to him by the prophet Nathan that there would be a curse upon his family and his children, and that strife would never leave his house.
Right.
And this is just one of the many stories that David experiences with his own family and his kids. And I think out of all the stories, this is probably the worst one.
Yeah. So, this is the danger for Christians today. We do a lot of things, not based on what God has to say or what God's opinion is, but based on what culture does. And we just go, oh, well, that, times have changed. Well, that was David's thought too. Well, times have changed. I'm going to do it. All the rest of culture does, rather than doing what God had said. And God had said that the leaders weren't supposed to be polygamists. And so because of the fact that he decided he was going to embrace culture, he winds up suffering similar circumstances that all the other kings would have dealt with. And that was all this intrigue and murder and violence and all these things. He's suffering the same consequences because he's behaving the same way.
Yeah.
And it's just a devastating moment. So anyways, Amnon is the son of one of his wives. Tamar is the daughter of one of his wives, that also Absalom is her actual brother, right? So a key phrase in those first 4 verses we read was that Amnon had a crafty friend.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So Amnon had been in love in an unreasonable way with his stepsister for a long time, to the point where it was making him sick. But he didn't act on that until Jonadab said, hey, I've got a plan for you.
Right.
We've got to really be careful about our friends.
Sure.
Right? I can remember when I was a young man, one of the best messages that I ever heard was Amnon had a friend. It was just that one phrase. It was talking about the importance of friends. And, your friends, the best thing you could do would be to find friends who are better Christians than you. That'd be the best thing. But oftentimes we find people that are at our level or maybe not even committed Christians, and then they bring us bad ideas, and then we act on them as if it's wise. I would say so many people do that. They just go fishing for answers out on Facebook. Hey, Facebook friends, what should I do in my marriage? What should I do in my raising my kids, whatever? And who cares about all those opinions? What we need is some good, godly opinions. And that phrase, Amnon had a very crafty friend, and that was a bad turn for him.
Yeah, so I'm going to speak at a camp here in a week or two to this up north somewhere in Michigan, and I'm thinking about doing this message. I'm still piecing together what I'm going to say, but I do this one message for high school students and adults and everything else, the full families, and that is think about the 3 key relationships in your life. Growing up, especially, they were your parents or your authorities and family, and then your relationship with your Heavenly Father, and then your relationship with your friends. And so imagine 3 dials that are on like a board in front of you. And imagine if you were to go back in time, chances are, if you were to adjust these relationships, you could probably avoid your greatest regrets.
Wow. So what a great illustration.
Isn't it great? So you could go back and just dial out the neighbor next door, and dial in a little bit of mom, or dial in a little bit more God, at this point. Yeah. And if you just adjust those relationships and make them stronger or weaker, you could probably avoid your greatest regrets, because most of our greatest regrets are influenced relationally.
Yeah.
So
then we are seeing here this friend who also is his cousin, gives him bad advice, and he takes advantage of it. And, when we're not in our right minds, when we are very deeply tempted, especially when it comes to sexual sins or some kind of addiction that we might have, we're not in our right minds. All we need is somebody to light that fuse, right? And then it winds up taking us in the wrong direction. So this is what he does, and he devastates Tamar. And what a horrible thing to do to the king's daughter. And then immediately hates her. He regrets what he does. Immediately hates her. And so often our sin turns out not to give us what we were hoping it would give us, right? How many marriages have you sat and listened to people talk, I can't believe I did this, and then that other person didn't mean anything to me, right? I don't even know. I was out of my mind. I don't know why I did it. I've heard that so many times.
Yeah, it's amazing. People actually, on the back end of their choices, say, I don't even know what I was thinking.
Yeah. Oh.
And part of that is because, the enemy of our soul twists our minds, and we get, caught up in our own lusts, and that's what the book of James tells us, right? And it produces and it snowballs and it brings forth sin, and in some cases death. And, what I was thinking about is the justification that somehow Amnon is trying to tell himself that he loves Tamar. And yet we see immediately after the rape that it's not true love, right?
Right.
So think about this.
He was just lustful.
Yes, he was lustful, but he was telling himself it was love.
Right.
And so that's a key.
We're great at lying to ourselves.
Right. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying, like, you can try to justify any bad decision. Yeah. Just trying to say, well, let me go ahead and leverage it this way, and maybe he did think, one thing, but he really wasn't in touch with, what was really real.
Right. So he lies to himself. He ruins her life.
Yes.
He makes a horrible, horrible circumstance. He throws her away, and Absalom files it away. One of the most astounding verses, I think, in David's entire life is verse 21. When King David heard what had happened, he was very angry.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
One of your princes raped one of the princesses. What are you talking about? And, I think many times we allow things to go on. We give certain people passes for horrible things. He should have treated Absalom like he would have treated anybody else who had done that circumstance.
Yeah, for sure.
She deserved justice, and he didn't give it to her.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of it is because David realized that he wasn't perfect. And, when David makes the comment and says, my sin is ever before me, the entire kingdom knew just what a scandal that David, wrapped himself in. And so
with Bathsheba.
Yeah, with Bathsheba.
Right.
And so here's another pretty big, pretty massive scandal, dynamic within the family. And so David, perhaps, he isn't sitting at a position where he's like, what were you thinking? He's probably thinking, yep, like I know what it's like to lust after somebody, and then to just, to have my way with her. Right. That's exactly what he did with Bathsheba.
Yeah.
So it's just a horrible thing.
If he had just confronted it as a good king should have, which he had been a good king for so long, if he had just confronted it, so many of the next stories we're going to tell over the next couple of days could have been avoided.
Yeah.
If he had just done the right thing. And a lot of times we avoid making a hard decision because we don't want to embarrass the family, because we don't want to do, we don't want to deal with it. And he sticks his head in the sand, and Absalom starts getting bitter because Absalom loved his sister Tamar, and he starts to file it away. And 2 years later, he throws this party all for the purpose of killing Amnon. But he had invited his dad to come to it. And his dad declined, but all your brothers can go. He wanted to have his brother killed in front of his dad, right? And his dad didn't go, so he has him killed. And this begins a whole series of death and uprising in David's family.
Think about that. It clearly goes out of its way to say that his desire, Absalom's desire, was to have his dad there. So, obviously that was his intention.
Yeah.
So what would have happened had he given the order to murder Amnon, and then David would have been sitting there? What would he have said to his dad? Hey, Dad, this is what you should have done.
Yes.
Right? Dad, here's what it means to actually stand up and be a leader.
Right.
Or to have justice. Right. Or to not be a coward. So David, I wonder if David had a hint of knowing that was coming. Probably not.
Right.
He didn't know.
I don't think so. I think he would have gone, because David was still, he was later in his career, but he was probably, I don't know the exact age, but he was probably late 50s. So he was still a warrior kind of a guy in this age, maybe in the 60s, because he dies when he's 70. But he still has a whole bunch of battles and fights in between this story and the end. So he must have been in his 50s, I would think, at this point. So, and I'm sure there's some scholar who knows the exact age, and you guys can put it in the comments, because I'm just talking off the top of my head on that one. But he was still strong enough he could have fought Absalom if he wanted to. So instead, he gets mad when he finds out that Absalom had killed Amnon, and then we stopped early in this, but he kind of banishes Absalom. He goes, you can come back to town, because Absalom hides for his life, and then he grieves over Amnon's death, and then finally says, okay, you can come back, but you will never see me again. We're not talking. And he basically has put his son in exile, even in his own home, and they weren't going to engage. And so you find Absalom now blaming his dad, and there's a lot of anger and bitterness, and that eventually boils over too.
Yeah. So yet again, we didn't even mention this, but yet again, here's another example of hatred and revenge, right? On Absalom's part. So, whenever we let things fester and we don't take care of them in the right way, they come out in the form of hatred, revenge, and it never ends well.
Yeah.
And so, we've talked about that in our recent podcasts, and yet here's another example. To be honest with you, there are probably a lot of listeners who have some pretty strong feelings like, hey, that's what Amnon deserved,
Right.
And, if somebody did that to my sister, that's probably how I would react too.
It's what the king should have done.
Yeah, it's what
the king shouldn't have had him murdered. The king should have had him executed.
Right. Well,
right.
Under the law.
Under the law.
And because
right.
that was his right, and back then that would have been.
But this wasn't Absalom's right to do it.
It wasn't Absalom's right.
But Absalom steps in and goes, Dad, if you're not going to be the man, I'm going to be the man.
Right.
Right. And it's just bad. There's another thing to think about. We're going to see this over and over and over again among David's sons. They have a pretty easy life. Right?
As most princes do.
Yeah, as most princes do. And people without purpose, especially young men, but people in general, men and women, without purpose, tend to become very self-centered. And then their simplest desires become obsessions. And they feel like they're being persecuted, or they feel like life is so hard, And I think in our culture today, especially those of us that live in the suburbs, and we finally have a little bit of money and we can provide for our kids, we start treating our sons and daughters like princes and princesses. And we're more concerned about their comfort and their happiness than we are about their character and their holiness.
Yeah.
And so David was great at providing all kinds of comfort and wealth and all this stuff to his kids. And then you see his kids making horrible decisions that are so self-centered. And that's what happens when we treat our children like princes and princesses all the time, instead of making them work and making them go through the difficult things, because it's difficulty and struggle that make you better and stronger and build character. And then God wants more than our happiness. God wants holiness. And it doesn't seem like those expectations are expected for the sons, even though this is a man who really loved God. David really loved God,
Right.
but you don't see him passing this on to his sons.
I remember seeing Dave Ramsey. For those listeners who know Dave Ramsey, he's a financial guru. And I remember
Sometimes when we're working on our budget, Bonnie and I hate Dave Ramsey when we're working on our budget. And sometimes if Bonnie stubs her toe, she screams Dave Ramsey's name like a cuss word.
well, Liz and I, whenever we have to, make choices that are not financially great, we always say that we tie and gag up Dave Ramsey and throw him in the closet.
There you go.
So anyway,
it's a love-hate relationship with Dave Ramsey. Yeah.
So anyway,
but boy, he helps a lot.
Yes. So let me get this out.
Please.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't let me interrupt you again.
You're gonna say one more thing?
No. If you have something you want to say, go ahead and say it.
All right.
Because I wouldn't want to interrupt you.
So, but he had made a comment and said to his son, you're going to have to earn this and earn this. And his son made a comment to him, and he said, "Why are you making me do all these things when, we have the money, Dad?" And he said, "Son, because one day," he said, "you're going to inherit a bunch of money." He said, "I want you to have enough character to manage it and be a good steward from it." Yeah. And so he's teaching his son that character is actually needed for responsibility, for money, for resources, and everything else. And so it was just a great little snippet there that David could have learned.
Yeah. So you have Amnon is lovesick and obsessed with his own desires because he doesn't have any purpose. And then you have Absalom thinking he can take justice into his own hands because he doesn't have a job. He doesn't have anything. He has no purpose either. And it's just this turmoil in the family. And so this can be a real parenting lesson, I think, for the people listening today, for me certainly, and for you as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's probably a good place to end.
I think so.
We will go ahead and see you next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.